Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this very important topic today. You will be getting credit. You have to stay the entire time, but you will be getting CEU credits if you want to do that. You just need to make sure you stop by at the end of the session today. Stop by one of the tables and get your badge scanned so that can record that you've been at this the whole time. All right. Thank you. I'm going to be your moderator today. I'd like to welcome you. I'm Lisa Smiley from Walker & Associates. I've been in the telecom and ICT industry for almost 30 years. I've served in many capacities for Walker & Associates. Currently, I am responsible for strategic growth initiatives regarding new manufacturing development. I'm committed to our business to ensure that we have OEM partners and meet the stringent corporate requirements of supply chain risk management for both Walker and our customers in order to provide stability, control, and integration of these manufacturers and reinforcing our business practices. Today, we will begin with one of our panelists, Linda Hutchinson. She's at Ciena Corporation, and she'll be discussing security threats and risks and valuable items to consider when you're pondering these. Once she concludes, we'll hear from our other three panelists who will be discussing how the National Cybersecurity Strategy's vision applies to them, what their response will be, and the impacts that they envision. We have two panelists from industry and one from government, and I'll introduce each as we begin. Following that, we'll have a question and answer time. We don't have a microphone, but I think the room is of size that we can hear the questions, and we will answer those. I'll start with a question, and I'll open it up for the floor to ask questions as time permits. The September 2018 National Cybersecurity Strategy is changing our national vision regarding supply chain risk management due to security risks uncovered in the last few years. Before we begin, I wanted to point out the 4 pillars that are mentioned in this strategy. Pillar 1, protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life. The objective of this pillar is to manage cybersecurity risk to increase the security and resilience of the nation's information and information systems. Pillar 2 is to promote American prosperity. The objective is to preserve United States influence in the technological ecosystem and the development of cyberspace as an open engine of economic growth, innovation, and efficiency. Pillar 3 is to preserve peace through strength. The objective is to identify, counter, disrupt, degrade, and deter behavior in cyberspace that is destabilizing and contrary to our national interests, while preserving United States overreach in and through cyberspace. Pillar 4 is the advance American influence. The objective is to preserve the long-term openness, interoperability, security, and reliability of the Internet, which supports and is reinforced by United States interests. While all these pillars are important, and the Department of Defense plays a role in each, Pillars 2 through 4 are extremely dependent on Pillar 1. Pillar 1 consists of securing federal networks and information, securing critical infrastructure, and combating cybercrime, and improving incident reporting, all of which are very interdependent. Supply chain risk management plays a role in all of the components of Pillar 1. Our information security supply chain is under attack and has been under attack for some time. Per the 2018 MITRE study on Delivered Uncompromised, a strategy for supply chain security and resilience in response to the changing character of war, nation-state adversaries have exploited cyber and supply chain vulnerabilities critical to U.S. security for hostile purposes. These include exfiltration of valuable technical data in the form of industrial espionage, attacks upon the control systems used for our critical infrastructure, manufacturing, and weapon systems, corruption of quality and assurance across a broad range of products and categories, and the manipulation of software to achieve unauthorized access to connected systems and to degrade the integrity of the system operation. I wanted to first introduce Linda Hutchinson. Linda is the Senior Director of North American Partner and Inside Sales Leader for Ciena Corporation. She's responsible for all aspects of Ciena's channel go-to-market strategy, the partner sales, and the field enablement for value-added resellers, systems integrators, solution providers, and managed service providers, covering enterprise, federal, and network operator markets. She's held senior leadership positions at both Avaya and Nortel previously, and she is an entrepreneur that launched an information security and risk management consulting firm, S2R Execution Bridge. She's a strong advocate for women in business, data privacy, information security, and STEM. And I'm going to turn it over to Linda to get us started.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me okay? I'm never short for words, so you ought to be able to hear me run pretty good once I get going. But listen, thanks today, and thanks, Lisa, in terms of the intro and for the panelists for participating. I wanted to start with just sort of a level set of making sure we're talking about the same thing when we say supply chain risk management, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there's the language people tend to use that sometimes make it too complex, and I just want to make sure we start off with the same foot, and then we can actually turn it over to some of the panelists for more detail for where they bring expertise in the space. So what do we mean by that? When you come here and you say, I'm coming to a supply chain risk management panel, wow, do you get all excited because you're going to actually get all energetic in the afternoon? What does that mean? It means how do you go through and identify and assess risk associated with your supply chain? Now, it doesn't mean supply chain just from a point of origin to destination. It also means everything in the life cycle, whatever that asset is. And so we want to broaden your definition and think about it from there's parts in the life cycle you've got to think about. And how do you actually manage that risk successfully? And then how do you define that risk? What is your definition of risk? Simplest definition, some sort of future event, likelihood it's going to occur, and a consequence. Have you thought through that in terms of what its impact is to your mission and to your business objectives? Why do you care about it? Well, if something gets disrupted in today's digital technology, how comfortable is your lifestyle if you don't have power? When you have a natural man-made disaster, those are issues. When it's a cyber intrusion and a power grid goes down, that's a problem. If you can't bank, that's a problem. Think about that on a military theater. When you can't perform your mission objectives when you need to, that impacts our national security. So it matters, and it matters every day. So how do we address it? It's really a matter of you've got to start understanding and think about your risk environment. Have you thought about where everything comes from that you need to do your job every day and to be successful? And do you have an idea of being able to understand the risk associated with all the people upstream and downstream associated with that? It's not about technology. If we just focus on the cyber aspect of it, you're missing probably 75-80% of it. Yes, that's important, and it's critical in terms of today's environment. But you've got to go beyond that and really think about the people, the process, and the technology and risk management and how that functions as a system. For geeks in here like me from an engineering background, it's control theory. Okay, it's a system of flows and ebbs, and how do you make sure you're managing that and really understanding sub-optimizing one component to the detriment of the system is not going to help you be successful in terms of your output. So translating that, it's risk. You've got to make a decision framework around what your comfort level is for your business and your mission objectives around your risk tolerance. And I say risk tolerance, I mean, how comfortable are you with the risk in your supply chain? From once you get it to when you deployed it and to when you actually dispose it. Have you thought through all those pieces? And would you be comfortable in any one of those stages having something compromised? So when you get beyond that, it really comes down to a couple of things. The supply chain today is super integrated. Like, how many of you are carrying something like this around? Okay? If you go on Apple's site, 6 continents, over 40 countries, 200 top suppliers, takes 33 pages to list all the suppliers in this. All right, so think about what a weapons system looks like, or an industrial control system. So when you think about it on the scale, that's an intricate web of a lot of different people that's in that supply chain. Do you know who all those people are? And do you trust the source of where those components are coming from? And I'm not trying to put the fear of God in you, but I do want you to stop and think. Because if you don't know, you need to ask. And you need to understanding what is your rings of relationship risk with every person in this supply chain. Because everything it builds up to your system, you're impacted by that. And the weakest link in that chain is what you have to consider, but not necessarily design and compensate for. It depends on the risk-based analysis and the impact you expect to see to your particular mission. Lots of different things we can talk about. I want to cover sort of 5 big things that these guys are going into a lot more detail on. It starts at the beginning of design. So when you think about whatever it is that you need, you have a vision. It's going to perform in some sort of theater and production environment. So what are the risks? How do you design from the beginning with security built in and not just bolted on afterwards? Because that's never going to be a good fit. You have design flaws that are accidental and intentional. It could be sabotage. It could just be poor design engineering work and coding, all of which can lead to compromise. Same thing when you come into data leakage and exfiltration. Some of that's intentional. Some of it's just poor design and engineering work and coding and not closing off doing things that you have in a testing environment. Anything between point A and point B, you got to get there somehow. Every port along the way leaves that someone can actually physically access that device, potentially alter it, substitute your components with counterfeit components, and put malicious code in. So you've got to think about all those things. But 2 of the biggest ones you probably don't think about, although maybe one of them you do today, is software. In a digital world, everything is built around software. Millions of lines of code. So software's king, but where there's an app for that, there is a hack for that. And if you don't know, if you're using open source software, and you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know who's contributing to that, then how strong is that foundation you are building your system off of without knowing that? And when there's a design flaw that's found and a vulnerability that's published, how quickly can you identify that source and recognize you have exposure to that in your network or in an IT system supporting your supply chain somewhere? So all of the things come into play, and it's not just what people think of, box A getting to box B in terms of supply chain. The other part is, as a service, how many service providers and outside contractors are you using today that touch some part of your supply chain? From beginning to design to delivery, installation, and disposal, you have a litany of different resources that are out there touching things. You've got to know that, and you have to rank those players in terms of how closely they are aligned to not just what they can deliver from a cost and a performance and a schedule perspective, but how closely are they aligned to what your objectives are from a security and a risk management expectation. You know, I know a lot of people who like to go bungee jump. That's not really my thing. That's outside of my risk profile. But there may be someone else who it is. So there you go. You want to go off with him. And I use that in jest, but I'm trying to say you want that comfort level with your suppliers at any part in this chain. Because if you don't have it, how are you going to get comfortable enough to know that they are looking at what they provide to you with the same level of due diligence in terms of what you need from them? So to kind of work through it and say it's the end-to-end ecosystem of insecurity and your relationship risk, vendor selection is super, super important. Like, if you get nothing else right, you've got to spend the time on that one. Do the deep dive, make sure you know that fit is there from culture. Make sure you understand where they're geographically based in terms of your manufacturing and your sourcing components. In the geopolitical environment today, you know, my company makes a conscious decision to stay away from China. We do no manufacturing, no distribution, no partnerships in China or with Chinese companies. That's important to us in the integrity of our supply chain. Are all your suppliers looking at it the same way? When you make those choices about those vendors, you've got to think about the business continuity and disaster recovery aspect. Because Murphy's Law is always going to win. Something bad's going to happen, whether it's intentional compromise, it's accidental, or it's a natural disaster. You are going to have to pivot, and pivot very quickly. That's too late to start vetting out alternate supply choices. You need to have predefined who those are, understand your risk profile in doing so, and being able to flip very quickly in terms of knowing what it takes to actually activate them and have whatever compensating controls readily available to deploy. So when you do it, you can manage that risk. When you go through the design and development, as I said from the beginning, you have to think about it. You cannot bolt it on. The only thing I'd add to that, because I know Jody's going to go a lot into this aspect, no system ever functions 100% in perfect environment, ever. Not even in a lab, typically. So you've got to plan for and design and challenge your engineers to design with systems that can be still functioning to deliver minimal capability even when compromised and degraded. And that's an aspect that a lot of engineers don't think about. So ask yourself, at what level of degradation of the systems and the components I'm having delivered in my supply chain can I still perform my mission? If you can't answer that question, it's one you need to actually work through and make sure you understand and hold your vendors accountable to deliver. Manufacturing and logistics Definitely it's around access, and I think some of those issues are well known about making sure physical access is contained, that you make sure the quality of the components coming in are authentic so you can avoid counterfeit and quality issues there. But you also need to make sure the chain of custody, whoever's on that path anywhere, what are they doing? How are they accessing what you're looking at? And are you comfortable when you receive it? It's actually what you ordered, and it's going to perform as you need it. Once we get to, I've got it, I validated it, I want to install it, right? I've gone through an awful lot, I should be in good shape. That's really where the work gets started, because now you've got to make sure it's configured properly, it's secured for your mission, it's actually going to be kept current and up to date. And anybody that's a boot on the ground, hands in the network, is technically trained and competent with the right clearances to do what you need to get done to manage the network. If you just go through and think about it, that once it's installed, it's good, you've missed half the battle. And you need to make sure that you really truly understand what your network norms are and your system norms, because it's not just the telecommunications network. It's your operating system that helps keep everything going. And so any IT system has a norm. Unless you know what that baseline is, how will you be able to recognize what an indicator of compromise is and what you need to do with that? Sort of wrapping all this up, it gets down to end of life. You know what? I've got it installed. I'm going to retire it. I'm good. You can find a lot of stuff in people's garbage. So think about this. Whatever has resident memory, whatever has configuration data, you need to consider that just as sacred as when you're actually doing something on the front end. Because if I have that data, I can extract that and actually learn a lot about your security posture based on what your past habits have been and data that's saved on that. So be careful about your disposal as well. So with all these things, it's a little bit overwhelming, and it's really easy for people to kind of go, wow, there's just such a big landscape of issues. How do I actually resolve them? The one thing that I would really say when I was looking at all these different initiatives that are out in the government right now, and I was like, wow, if I was really going to hang my hat on one to say go read and learn and try to do a best practice with, it's the one you just referenced, Lisa, in terms of the MITRE, the joint MITRE and DoD effort with Deliver Uncompromised. If you haven't had a chance to read through that. It's really around the landscape has changed. It's really moving to 4 different fronts, and it's around going beyond just cost, performance, and schedule, and looking at how an integrated security and risk management approach and a qualification factor for procurement comes into play. Because in that scenario, supply chain is one piece. You have cyber physical in terms of weapon systems and industrial control systems is one domain. You also have traditional cyber from an IT perspective. But the other piece is the human factor, and it's all of us. And we own that from our personal responsibility to be aware and make sure of everything we do every day, we're thinking about what this impact is and how we can actually go through. Wow, I did that really good, right on time. And how we can actually go through and make a positive contribution to that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the rest of the panel and tee it up for Brad Minnis with Juniper. Brad?
All right. Yes, thank you, Linda. I appreciate you setting our tone for the day, and I'd like to welcome Brad Minnis. He is the Vice President of Environmental, Health, Safety, and Security for Juniper Networks. They're based out of Sunnyvale, California, where he is responsible for strategic design, implementation, and management of the company's security, safety, environment, crisis management, and business continuity functions. He also leads the company's effort in corporate citizenship and sustainability, and he manages the corporation's government-related security programs. He's been in Silicon Valley for 30 years. He has 10 years that he served with the Navy, and he's co-written several publications on software integrity assurance and supply chain security with organizations such as SafeCode. He's also certified as a protection professional. Brad?
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for attending. The simple fact, and I've been working in supply chain security for many, many years in Silicon Valley. The fact is that we are under attack. I think the attack vectors are changing. Not only now are they going after us, but they are going after our suppliers. And if you think about who are those suppliers for IT-related companies, you have component manufacturers, you have assembly houses, you have design facilities, R&D and testing houses, managed service providers, outsourced tech support and outsourced call centers, and other sorts of suppliers of different things for your products and for support of your customers. The bad guys are not only going after us, they're going after them now. I think you've seen a lot of news about attacks on IBM and looking at who are their customers if they're providing managed services. They're targeting other customers through our suppliers. And so it's very important that all aspects of a company work together to deal with this issue. I think one of the things that was mentioned was you've got to look at a product from the entire life cycle perspective. That's one of the things we've been doing for many, many years. It's R&D, it's IP protection, it's the development environment. How are you securing your IT infrastructure? It's prototyping, it's legal department, it's procurement and manufacturing and distribution and support and InfoSec and physical security. If all of the pieces of the puzzle in the company are not working together to achieve the objective of providing a secure product to our customers, any point in the chain can fail. And so it's very important that you look at each area of the product life cycle and dissect it for areas of potential vulnerability. One of the things that we do very well is looking at our products, identifying areas of how they could be attacked and where they could be attacked and the use cases for that, and then designing preventions in to make sure that can't happen. Technology plays a role, but also management plays a role. It was mentioned that vendor selection is a very important aspect of the puzzle. I think we look at that a little bit differently. It's not only about selecting the vendor, but then it's about how do you manage the vendor and work with them to make sure that you're identifying those areas of vulnerability and they are protecting the information just as much as you are. So again, from concept and feasibility, we look at what are the potential customers for this product, what are our customers' security issues, and then how can we design a product that addresses those issues. Once we've done a risk assessment and identified those areas of vulnerability, then we look at the R&D and the manufacturing. The risks may drive where R&D is done. R&D, if you look at R&D operations in large tech companies, the R&D can be done in multiple countries around the world. If you really dissect it, you may sign a contract with a business in the U.S., but the developers are actually in Poland or in South America or in Asia somewhere. Really, it's understanding what the vendors are doing and where they're providing those services for you, and taking appropriate actions to, again, look at the process of how they're doing it to make sure it's secure. When you get into procurement for the product, we have hundreds and sometimes thousands of suppliers to build a Juniper product. These suppliers are located all over the world, and so how do we understand where all of these products are coming from and what are the areas of vulnerability associated with those products? Obviously, you can't boil the ocean and look at 1,000 suppliers, so the philosophy is to identify what are those components or functions within the product that could be exploited by an attacker. How might they go about that, and then in putting the preventions in place to prevent that from occurring. We were born as a technology and an engineering company. Our philosophy on security is that we can solve a lot of these hard problems through technology. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that we're preventing others' ability to counterfeit us. We're preventing the infiltration of counterfeit components into our supply chain, and then looking at what components could be exploited in that process and how that might be done, and building in technology to detect that and also build processes around preventing that. Again, working with our manufacturing partners, product procurement is a very important piece of this puzzle. Where are you buying your products from? only buying from authorized sources is a tenet of our brand integrity program. So we prevent the introduction of substandard or counterfeit components. Most companies will go out to a manufacturer and then hand over the entire process to them, which includes the procurement of components. When you're a contract manufacturer, cost is everything, and so the incentive there is for outsourced providers to go source components at the lowest cost they can. A lot of times that means going out of the authorized channel and buying from the gray market or buying from brokers. These are the channels where substandard and counterfeit components live. And so really keeping a close eye on and setting standards for your suppliers on how they do things to make sure it's done in the most secure way possible. We feel like our products are most vulnerable when we ship them from our factory to our end user customers. Edward Snowden a few years ago made allegations that the NSA and others were intercepting shipments of our products and performing some sort of an attack on the product or a modification of code that was destined for particular customers. So we had an outcry of customers, mostly international, wondering how can we prevent that or how can we detect that if it actually occurs. And so we've built a program around that to ensure that what we ship to our customers and what they receive is the same thing that we put into the system when we built it to make sure that the product can't be tampered with. And again, we use both physical protections as well as technology protections to detect that sort of activity. Whenever the product is out of our hands, and that generally means during customs clearance or either in the outbound country from the country it was manufactured or inbound clearance, if any of our shipments get open for inspection, they are now deemed to be untrusted for particular customers like the DoD and the government. Anytime the product is out of our hands, if it's been open for inspection by anybody other than our own people, we then don't trust it and we'll return it to the factory for a new shipment to go out. So distribution is very important, and one of the things to think about if you're a customer, most of our freight terms tend to be the customer selects the carrier and comes and picks up the freight from us, so we lose visibility when it leaves our dock. Again, the incentive for people is to do things as cheap as possible, so they'll hire a carrier to come pick up a product, and unbeknownst to them, on a shipment that goes from California to the D.C. area, that product can sit in multiple warehouses on the way to the East Coast. It can sit with different trucking firms and different carriers that may or may not have security standards in place to protect the product. And again, if you think the product is most vulnerable when it's in transit, that certainly is. And so understanding what the shipping mechanisms are for when you buy products, particularly for mission-critical systems, is very important. We have a secure shipping mechanism where we will ship a product from our factory in a sealed container with GPS tracking and supervision in one truck all the way to the end user, rather than taking multiple routes and sitting in a warehouse somewhere for potentially days where it could be damaged. But then there are a lot of customer responsibilities that go along with this also. And so, I see it time and time again, most of the issues we have, both with government customers, but as well as private customers, is sourcing product from unauthorized sources. There's one particular government agency that called me earlier this year that said, hey, we're having problems with a number of accessories, optical transceivers, and the network was failing, and so they shipped the transceivers to us. It turned out that they were counterfeit, so we went back and said, you didn't buy these from us. Where did you get these from? And of course, quiet was the only thing you heard on the other end of the line. But the fact is, buying from unauthorized sources can lead to big problems. We can't tell what happened to the product after it leaves us and goes to the first customer. If a customer resells that into the marketplace, We don't know who's touched it. We don't know who may have tampered with it, and neither do you. So again, buying through authorized channels is probably the most important thing that you as a customer can do. But as was mentioned, also it's how you operate the product. We ship products that are enabled with a lot of features. Many of those features you may not use in your network or your operation. So it's very important that the people that set up these systems and configure them know what they're doing. And so you disable many of the features that you're not using because they can create unintentional problems down the road. And so again, it's all about how you operate your network and how you understand the configuration. I think there was a news article that came out earlier this year about the Russians exploiting home network routers because people did not change the default password in the router when they received the device. The exploit was hundreds of thousands of devices. And again, it all boils down to either lack of understanding or lack of seriousness in how you manage and configure your systems. Then tech support, another big issue. We have outsourced tech support contractors that live all over the world because we have a distributed model, so we can serve customers in any geography at any time of the day or night. A lot of these people are in facilities that may not be secure. So it's important to understand who are the people that you're doing business with, not only when you select them, but then as you do business with them, understanding what their processes are and implementing security protections. We believe partnerships with our critical suppliers, and again, I mentioned identifying those potential areas of vulnerability in a product, either whether they be components or software, and working with those suppliers on the security of their development environment. We are a target of foreign governments, and our software is a target for BIOS attacks and others. So again, if you think that you are a target, your suppliers automatically become a target also. And certainly recently we've seen an increase in cyber activity with the trade war in China. There's an increase in malicious cyber activity, both directed at us and directed at our suppliers. Really important to stay on top of that. And I think the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Jody is public-private partnerships are really important to dealing with the issue of supply chain integrity. We have particular groups that are sponsored by nation states that are focused on the networking industry. There are, you heard about APT-10, which was focused on the managed service industry. Being able to share methods and operations and details of incidents with the private sector in a timely fashion is really critical to dealing with especially foreign nation state attacks on our IT infrastructure and our products. DIB is a really good, the DIBnet has actually in the last few years gotten a lot better about info sharing. FBI, Department of Homeland Security, these are all areas that it's very important to quickly share information with industry so we can take preventive action or detect problems when they're happening. So with that, I'll stop. And
thank you, Brad. We appreciate that. Next, we have Judy Schatz. She is SafeNet AT's Chief Product Officer. She's responsible for SafeNet AT's product management and engineering efforts in support of delivering data protection solutions to the U.S. federal government. She is responsible for the strategic planning for the company and taking SafeNet AT's product to the next level. Jody?
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so just like any aspect of security within a business, it requires a complete shift in mindset, and it's typically best for that to start from the top down. So just as we're seeing the U.S. government pushing out new policies and mandates like the National Cybersecurity Strategy, industry really needs to follow suit as well. We need to remember that compliance does not equal security. Security needs to be addressed in all aspects of business to get the attention it deserves, and certainly the supply chain security is no exception. So Linda did a great job of outlining at a conceptual level a lot of the considerations for securing your supply chain. So I'm going to dig into a couple specifics around the design and development and then manufacturing areas. So the supply chain threat is not just something that happens during the delivery of a product. Many people often associate supply chain with contract manufacturers, manufacturing components, widgets, hardware-centric. But as Linda mentioned, software is becoming much, much more prevalent. There's billions of lines of code out there. Many software applications now are made with greater than 70%, according to Veracode, greater than 70% open source. So there's a lot of consideration that we need to take into account for the vulnerabilities and exploits that can come from using software. And it needs to be addressed through each phase of development. So whether that's the design phase, the actual coding, all the way through from concept through the manufacturing for both hardware and software components being sourced, and then all the way into, as Linda mentioned, for the full life cycle to the end of life and how you handle sustainment and closing of that particular product. So making sure that you have a rigid product development life cycle is really, really important. Certainly, that's a pretty basic thing. You think of, design and code reviews and some security checks that need to come into play, making sure you don't have faulty designs or unintentional vulnerabilities that are coming into your product. But one component for a product development life cycle is called DevSecOps. And over the past several years, the focus was primarily on DevOps, which is a collaboration between the development teams and the operations teams in trying to release a product to the market. But over the past several years, security has become much more prevalent. So now that DevOps has evolved into DevSecOps, and now security is an integral part of that whole process. One part from a DevSecOps perspective could be implementing what's called a CI/CD pipeline. So this is a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline. The intent of this is really to add appropriate checks and balances for security all the way through in an automated process for the development and build lifecycle. So CI/CD refers to a process that really promotes engineers acting in an agile manner and producing more frequent builds with less changes, but on a much more frequent basis. And the goal is to automate the build process, the packaging, and the testing of that particular product. So some examples of security steps that can be added and built in and automated into a CI/CD pipeline could include static analysis to make sure that the structure of the code is sound without actually having to execute the code. There's a lot of available tools on the market that you can build into your pipeline. Vulnerability scanning. Scans, there's a lot of tools out there as well, some open source where you can check for common known vulnerabilities and exploits. Signing of images and making sure that you're using solid signatures that are verified. That way the end user can validate that the product that they're receiving is coming from a trustworthy source. And then also even around the security of how to handle containers. Containerization and containerized frameworks has become much more prevalent over the past several years. And there's a number of tools out there and checks you can put in to your CI/CD pipeline. In fact, earlier this year, I think it was in May, Cisco reported that since December of 2015, Alpine Linux Docker has been releasing images with hard-coded credentials and a null password for their root user. So there were a lot of implications that came out of that. That was a huge challenge, but if they had built that into an automated process with their CI/CD for their build process, then they could have added checks to make sure that least privileges were being implemented, checks to make sure that their super user accounts were either disabled or removed and did not have any null passwords associated with it, and it would have been done in an automated way rather than finding out after the fact. So a second area from a best practice perspective is implementing what could be called a security working group. Some companies will have a security champion. But a security working group is essentially a team of security-minded individuals within a company who are involved in product initiatives from the concept phase, so from the very, very beginning. And they have the security-first mindset to drive cross-functionally across the company. So they're going to drive security into every aspect of what that product is. And it's ultimately going to drive actions throughout the company, whether it's for engineering or operations, even marketing and manufacturing. So a couple checks that could be considered, and there's a whole host of things that can be considered early on when you're talking about conceptually what this product is going to do and what you're going to deliver. What is the attack surface going to be for this product? How are we going to reduce the attack surface? This could be, is the product going to have cameras or Wi-Fi or antenna or open USB ports that will make it vulnerable to attacks? From a secure deployment perspective, will we have default settings and configurations? Linda noted that even on the end-of-life process, if you have some of those configurations built in, that's something that can become a problem. Making sure you understand from when the product is built from the ground up and how those are deployed and making sure that those aren't susceptible to an attack is a good thing to build in. Physical features such as maybe tamper protections. Are we going to have zeroization capabilities built in? Cryptography. What type of algorithms are we using to securely encrypt or protect our data? What keys are we using? Are we going to be building our product to support crypto agility so that when NIST eventually approves quantum crypto-resistant algorithms, sorry. I usually get that right. Quantum-resistant algorithms, that we'll have the ability to roll those out in a seamless manner. Authentication, is it going to support multi-factor authentication? Auditing, logging, monitoring, all of those things being built in. Even, are we going to go with onshore or offshore suppliers? Making sure all those decisions are decided from a company perspective at the very beginning is critical to ensuring that security is built in as a foundation to that particular product. The next area, the third area I would say, is making sure that your company is enforcing an insider threat policy. And this is not just making sure it's enforced, but also thoroughly training your employees on what that means. So certainly, what does an insider threat mean? But then what would be their obligations if they were to identify suspicious behavior? Study after study finds that unintentional breaches caused by carelessness or ignorance are far more common than insider threats. So making sure that they understand what steps they need to take. For example, so you may be the most loyal employee, but if you become susceptible to a spear phishing email attack and you give up your network logon, you may have created more damage for your company than an actual spy would have. So there's a lot of things that can be taken into account there. In fact, the IT department, there's a number of steps they can take when it comes to insider threat protection as well. Enforcing separation of duties and privileges, assigning least privileges to employees so that they're not opening up their entire network to all employees, but giving them what privileges they need to actually do their jobs. Logging, monitoring, and auditing all of online behaviors of the employees, preventing and limiting disclosure of classified or CUI data, and then implementing secure backup and recovery mechanisms so that in the event something were to happen and data were to be lost, that they would have a backup mechanism to go and recover that. And then the last one around design and development is what I like to call a technology import process. So this is essentially a risk assessment for any piece of technology, whether it's hardware or software, that you would like to potentially bring into your product. And this is an import process or review process that needs to be done early in, not after you've built it into your product and then you make this assessment. Typically, there's two groups of people that are associated with kind of this team that would handle this technology import review. So the first team would be folks who are doing the analyzing, the collection of the data, and actually identifying the risks. The second group of people would be it's the assessment team that's reviewing that data that's been collected and then deeming whether those risks are something that the company is willing to accept and to bring that code or hardware component into their product for release to market. So a couple focuses for a technology import process. First is really understanding what is the origin of this piece of technology. Even if it was developed, whether it's hardware or software, on U.S. soil, that does not negate the potential for a risk. Doing an architectural review and trying to collect all of the design documentation from the vendors as much as possible. Sometimes that can be more difficult. But really doing a thorough baseline knowledge understanding of what is this piece of technology, what does it do, how is it structured, how would we potentially incorporate it into our product. So really kind of doing that baseline level evaluation. If it's a piece of software or firmware that's going on a hardware component, you can do code analysis, whether it's static or dynamic. You can also do some security vulnerability testing on it. And then ultimately, you're going to do a risk assessment, which is identifying, after collecting all that data, what are each of the risks that have been identified, what is the potential harm or threat that they can each cause, and there would be a rating associated with it, and then what is the likelihood of occurrence. So once you have that, then the assessment team can kind of jump in. And this really helps because obviously we can't focus on everything with the same level of intensity. As Linda mentioned, there's a whole host of considerations from supply chain. But this type of an assessment will help you focus for that piece of technology, which risks do we really need to focus on relative to likelihood of occurrence and the harm that it could cause to the company. So the assessment team can then make that determination. And then the last area I'd like to focus on is manufacturing. It's really just one main thing, and making sure that your company has a stringent supply chain risk management plan in place. Both Linda and Brad mentioned, the vetting of the vendors and suppliers. So having your operations team primarily would be the ones who would own it, do an assessment of all of your contract manufacturers to make sure that they meet your minimum criteria, whether that's it needs to be an ITAR-proof facility, or they require ISO certifications. Maybe you only want to have U.S. citizens working on your particular product and doing the manufacturing and deployment of it. Do they have the ability to build in tamper-proof packaging? Is that something that's required? Do they have, what level of validation on parts do they do for each of their suppliers, and how many tiers down do they do it to ensure there's no counterfeit parts? What is their level of testing? Is it random? Is it on every piece of, every component that comes off the line? So there's a list of criteria. Once you have that, then you can develop for your company an approved vendor list, which we've called an AVL, so that you can then know specifically which contract manufacturers your company has approved and you're comfortable moving forward with, and you understand, like Linda said, you have kind of a shared understanding on the security that you're working towards. The National Insider Threat Center at Carnegie Mellon University found that over 15% of insider threat incidents come from the own company's supply chain organization, so whether it's a 2 or 3rd tier down. So even if an organization is not legally required today to have a supply chain risk management plan in place, the ISO 28001 series is a great point for starting to develop a robust set of requirements and kind of guidelines that you can create one. And it'll give you a number of different kind of policies and procedures and things that you should keep in mind from a risk assessment perspective. So the bottom line is, I think if government agencies are going to start taking the steps that they need to meet the requirements for these new mandates that are coming out, they need to be working with vendors in the industry who are taking security very, very seriously and have the ability to demonstrate what actions they are taking to ensure that they are putting out the most secure products. So lastly, know your suppliers, know where your pieces of technology, whether it's hardware or software, are coming from, because it all matters, and supply chain is very quickly becoming one of our number one targets.
All right, thank you, Jody. And last, but certainly not least, we have Mr. Adam Nucci. He is a DoD SES, and he is the Acting Director of Cyber, Electronic Warfare, and Information Operations, Headquarters, Department of the Army, G3, 5, and 7. Before assuming this position, Mr. Nucci was the Cyber Capabilities Technical Director in the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Command, Control, Communications, Cyber, and Business Systems, or C3CB Directorate. Thank you. He also served as Associate Director for ISR and Cyber Issues in the Office of Joint Operations Support. He's also served as a Deputy Director for the Technical Intelligence in the Office of Director, Defense, Research, and Engineering. And also, prior to joining the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Nucci served as the Deputy Program Manager of the Office of Naval Research, or ONR, Undersea Weapons Technology Program. So, Mr. Nucci, I'd love to hear what, from a government standpoint, what you think about supply chain.
So, in the interest of time, we have 15 minutes left. How you guys doing out there? You guys doing okay? Doing okay? We've hit you with a lot, so I'd just like to know my audience a little bit. Real quick, how many military or former military members do we have? Thank you very much for your service. You guys totally outnumber me. How many are now in industry? Okay. How many gubbies do we have? Gubbies, okay. So thanks for that. So last question. How many of you have, as part of your normal job, some of the supply chain risk management challenge set? Okay, so fewer hands. So this is a tough problem. I'm going to only talk for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to open up for a little bit of questions. Okay. So I'm a career engineer, and my background started off in submarines. So when you work in submarines, I worked at a time when we had these funny things. They were called military standard parts. I remember the day that we changed the policy and said we're no longer going to build things from those. I see heads nodding. I'm not the only one from that era, right? I also was one of the only ones certified to program in a weird language called ADA. ADA was designed as a software package that could not do anything but what you told it to do. And we're not in that world anymore, right? That world has fundamentally changed. So on the average day, my focus as a director within the G3 of the Army is really on something we heard from General Funk and from General Fogarty, and that's the fact that maneuver warfare and the soldiers that are going to go out and use this equipment, that's where the risk that we build into these things actually ends up residing. Okay? And we have a certain responsibility. And there's been a little bit of a debate, right? So on one hand, we train soldiers who use our equipment to maintain it and equip it in the field. So what happens when some of these risks we've talked about gets in the hands of a soldier? Okay, we have to be in a place where we understand from a logistics perspective what's what and where it is. That takes a lot of data, and that has to be a dynamic problem set, and we have to work the workforce problem right off the bat. Okay, that's that's the place where I live and work every day. Now it's interesting. I'm in the G3 of the Army. That's the operations part of the Army. Now, I have a great set of partners within the Army. This area of supply chain risk management, quite frankly, is bigger than just the cyber supply chain. So I want to make sure that's really clear. And that's really our viewpoint. You have to start this problem much broader. So I have a very strong partnership with the G6 of the Army. I really work very closely with them. Great partners. With ASALT, our acquisition community, with the Army Materiel Command, who runs our logistics. In the Army, we have now built at a very senior level, a level of recognition that this is one of the endemic challenges that we're going to deal with as we go to do major combat operations. So, sort of one of my messages is this is a problem that's not going away. To start my first message, you can't think small. Okay, you have to be thinking about this holistically, and that's really where the Army is. We've recognized that awareness is absolutely part of the equation. Go look at any data, okay? Go look at cyber breach data. Go look at data from DC3, who does a lot of the analysis when an event happens. There's a fact. As soon as people become aware of the problem, all of a sudden it's a lot bigger. And that's because you didn't know about it to start with. And then we start applying really good ways of bringing that down. That's called risk management. That's something we do every day. And it's not static. It is not a one-and-done thing. So let me tell you a little bit about sort of how the Army is sort of framing this problem space and a couple of things that we're doing to sort of change the game a little bit and how we're actually trying to build a program around it. First thing, let's see, is a couple of observations. This is not new. There's a couple parts of this supply chain risk management challenge that I feel like we've gotten that's actually pretty mature. And that's where we kind of started. When we started from the government perspective is we made this an acquisition problem. We've built some careful pieces of what's called program protection. Now, something is mature in the Army if there's actually an Army regulation that talks about it and a field manual. And we have both of those for program protection. And you know what? They're actually just about right. There's concrete responsibilities for all those partners I talked about. I also have found that there's a couple of other leading indicators that we're actually making progress in this space. And I'll give you two. So I've been going around to the vendors, I want to say. It's really kind of heartwarming to me when I sit down with vendors and they're thinking very innovatively about things like how I'm going to do logistics. There's a lot of examples of that. The other is that I've noticed that companies, including all three of you, have people who are really focused that this is their core job. There's a business unit that's responsible for this. In the case of delivering military capability and program management, I think we've really started to mature in that space. That's sort of the core of one of the things that the Army has been focused on for a while. And since we decided that we were going to have secure weapon systems and networks, it's maturing in two other directions. So across our risk tolerance, you mentioned risk tolerance, that's a great framing, right, is we've really focused on programs. But the Army has a strategy, and if you read the Army strategy, you'll find out that we're really focused right now on readiness. And somewhere around 2022 to 2023, the Army is going to really shift gears into modernization. Aha. That means that part of this problem is about technology protection. So we have a couple of pieces that are in place. We have teams that figure out how modernization is happening down to the core technology with Army Futures Command and with the other components of the Army. And then we have programs to try to work with industry and academia. So as we develop those, we're trying to do that design from the get-go in that kind of secure fashion. Because here's what the reality is. For a long time, we've talked about military capability dominance, right? And that was the thing that was the most important, and we managed cost, performance, and schedule. And security was a bolt-on. Requirements are moving, so these two spectrums are now starting to be considered in an equal balance between capability delivery and resilience. But it's operational resilience. I'll talk about operational resilience for just a minute. Okay. Now, we focus a lot on products, but in the case of the Army, there's three big categories where I have to do technology protection, program protection, and operational resilience. And they're these. Enterprise IT. This is all of my networks in enterprise IT. The second is weapon systems, and in weapon systems, I'm including the tactical networks. There's plenty of examples actually on the floor. And the third, which is not as mature and potentially more challenging, is critical infrastructure. So let me put some numbers on that, okay? IT. Current numbers is the Army operates what is, over between 1.5 and 2 billion endpoints. And I'll be corrected by that. Don't quote me on that. That's in scope of magnitude is about right. In weapon systems, you have to focus on what's mission critical, but really across the Army, we have 5 modernization priorities. We're modernizing the network, integrated air and missile defense, long-range precision fires. Now, those three I talk about together for a reason. The systems that operate them are time critical. If you look at the missions that we operate, you're time critical for all three of those. The other two are future vertical lift and next-gen ground combat vehicles. Now, those will move based on physics and not as much on the information. It's going to be important for them to have information, but they're going to be somewhat disadvantaged. So our modernization is really working in those 5 areas. So that's the weapon systems. About 120 primary major acquisition programs and systems. Now let's talk about infrastructure. The Army currently is in the process of looking at over 350 bases and installations, on which we think there is roughly between 300,000 and 1.2 million industrial control systems of different configurations. Wow. That's the Army challenge. And operating those in an operational resilience way means we now have a primary program that my team with the G6 is starting to build, and we have a focus on operational resilience, and it's a main focus going into what is called the Army Campaign Plan. So it's a joint effort across the Army and with industry, and it has 5 major lines of effort. I'll start with number 1. We have decided that we're going to implement what we call the 5th domain of readiness. So a unit that deploys with equipment, we measure them for readiness all the time. So we're now thinking about what's the framework for how you think about these risks and manage these risks so you maintain readiness, which you're going to modernize. And so we're building a readiness framework, and that's been a new start. We're on a 180-day sprint with Army senior leadership to really kind of formalize that. Number 2, This started with a congressional legislation. It's the evaluation of both weapon systems and critical infrastructure, which you then have to figure out how to mitigate. Now, guess what? That's not just material. That means you have to do non-material things as well. You've got to change how you do business, how you train. And there's that second level. Our line of effort number 2 is really on weapon systems. Number 3 is really on infrastructure. Our 4th line of effort is to actually evaluate what are the critical missions. Okay? Your risk tolerance has to do with your ability to understand from an adversary's perspective and from how we're going to build combat power, what those mission critical systems are, and you hold those in a different level of, you have less risk tolerance, and so you do much more dynamic scrim against those, and trying to figure out both those priorities and what the critical terrain is where we're going to apply defense in depth. We don't have an answer for that yet. That's going to require a lot of analysis. And then the 4th is we're going to develop a much more comprehensive supply chain risk management program for the Army. For starters, we know it's going to involve this awareness, training both the workforce and the military, and then actually testing how those adversary attacks might actually be handled by the military. We're going to have to do with our partners in industry illumination of that supply chain. That's going to turn into a dynamic, I'm going to hire data scientists, pull all the data together and manage it dynamically. Why? The supply chain is constantly moving. The third-party supplier in both infrastructure and in commodity IT presents some real challenges. Why? Because you're no longer looking at transactions. It's all in sales data, and there's multiple ways that those things can get delivered. And that's really how we try to make things cost-effective. And the third is to put metrics around that kind of risk management and turn that into something that's dynamic that the Army works on. I'll stop there, and then we have a little bit of time for questions, I guess.
Yes. We'll take a couple of questions. I know we're running short on time. If you, the panelists will be around for a few minutes afterwards if you have individual questions, but would like to thank each of the panelists for their contributions and for being here today. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes.
So, I'm an old Army warrant officer, and I grew up in the motor pool. And if I needed a new glow plug for a Humvee, I go to my supply guy and I say, give me a glow plug for a Humvee. I don't expect him to do all this supply chain stuff research and stuff. I just expect to have a trusted glow plug show up. So down at the tactical level, I'm not sure how much value we expect from our units on supply chain risk management. But what are we going to do at the operational level? What are we going to do at the strategic level? We hear now, war white rings, war white robbers, bad, don't buy them, get them out of the United States. And the same with DD homes and things. I'm more worried about what are we doing at the strategic level and the operational level to ensure that my sergeant, when he needs to go like
I'd love to have every answer for you. We already have people walking out the door. I'm happy to talk to you about that a little bit on the side. But the problem you've stated is why we need a little bit of a spectrum of approach to how we do this. And we're just getting started. So those are very key questions that we actually have to answer.
Well, Mr. Nucci, I think with the illumination and the accountability, the things that you talk about, and the scoring and that you're talking about, I think will be fantastic things for the Army to move forward in a much more secure environment. So, thank you guys for your time and attendance, and thank you.